All right, guys, so a lot of you have asked how to increase your SAT score or your PSAT score. So I want to kind of walk you through some of the basic principles, the ins and outs, the things that you really need to know. And so what I'm going to be using is the PSAT guidebook that they gave you this year. So if you should have your PSAT registration packet, there should be a sample copy of the test inside. So that's the one that I'm going to be referring to when we talk through things. All right, so a couple of quick things about the PSATs and the SATs in general. You lose 1/4 of a point every time you guess, and you guess incorrectly. However, if you leave an answer blank, you get 0 points. It doesn't mean, though, that if you don't answer a whole bunch of questions and you answer 3 right, that you're going to get a perfect score on your SATs. In fact, it means the opposite. It's prorated. Every one that you don't answer brings down the total score that you can get. The general rule for the PSATs and SATs is that if you can narrow it down to 50-50, it's a good idea to go ahead and guess. So again, if you can give it a shot, if you can guess, and you're pretty sure, go ahead and make that choice because it's going to earn you more points than ultimately it's going to lose you. All right, so now we're going to go through each one of the sections piece by piece and go over some of the big things that you need to know in order to do well. The beginning of the verbal section is going to give you the easiest opportunity to get some points. The vocabulary section for most is the easiest part of the SAT or PSAT. I would go ahead and, as I said, if you can rule out to 50-50, go ahead and make the guess for the points. You don't want to lose out by leaving these blank unless you really can't rule out any of them. In every section, I would not leave any more than maybe 3 or 4 blank. Go ahead and make that guess and see if you can get the points, if you can at least narrow them down to what the most likely choice will be. Okay, when you do the vocabulary section, the general rule is to try to fill in the blank with the word that completes the sentence. So do it in your head before you even look at the answer choices, and then it'll help you to rule out some synonyms and some antonyms. Do that for both the single blank questions where there's 1 blank and for the double blank questions where there's 2. Other tips, again, look at the roots of words, look at prefixes, suffixes, see if you can help to rule certain things out simply because you know those prefixes or suffixes. So if you take a look at like question number 4 on the PSAT practice test, it tells you there has been a recent blank of interest in the art of the painter Yoi Kusama. Once at the blank of critical consciousness, her work is very now near the center. To answer that question, generally what I would do is that there's been a recent increase of interest. So once at the margins or the fringes of critical consciousness, her work is now near the center. And again, if I look at some of these words and I don't know what they mean, I can obviously get rid of some of them, like the word core means center, so that one can't be the correct piece. When I start looking at words like subsidence, even if I didn't necessarily know the word sub means down, so that would immediately kind of get rid of that. Restoration obviously is not the answer. So just by process of elimination, I can get it down to C. Resurgence, and re means again, to surge means to rise, so to rise again. And if you didn't know the word periphery, which means to the side, then you could kind of basically whittle down your answers simply by eliminating some of the answer choices. So in terms of the vocabulary section, the first ones are usually the easier ones, and then they get harder as you go along. And again, sometimes they're going to give you words that you might not necessarily know. Look for those prefixes, look for those suffixes or root words so that can help you to narrow them down, even if you're not familiar with the word themselves. And again, the PSAT top high frequency list is a good list to just kind of refamiliarize yourself with if you still have a copy of those pieces. Those are really helpful, and they tend to be the ones that they use. If you look at the SAT or PSAT practice from 2014, you'll notice that a lot of the words that were on the list, like altruism, anecdote, corroborate, ephemeral, all of those were on that SAT high frequency word list. In the critical reading section, there are going to be several types of passages. Keep in mind that these passages are going to be awfully boring, and they do this on purpose. They tend to pick pieces from subjects that are difficult for people to read or their least favorite subjects. And for most people, those tend to be history and science. So you're going to see a lot of really boring passages, and the idea that they know is that most people won't be bothered to read them, and you really cannot score well unless you read the passages, hence the title of the section, Critical Reading. So there's several different types of passages, and again, the easiest type is the short passage. They're going to give you very short passages, and they're going to ask you to answer questions about that. So if you look at the SAT or PSAT practice test, questions 9 and 10 are based on the following passage, and then it's followed up by questions 11 and 12 that are about a second passage. So short passages are, again, a good place to earn some points. The second thing that you're going to find are comparative passages that are relatively short. And again, comparative passages are going to ask you to put passage 1 and 2 into conversation with each other. So again, what's the point of passage 1, and does it agree or disagree with passage number 2? Those short passages, again, can be pretty tricky though. So as you're looking at the short passages, make sure that you take a moment to practice that PSA method that we'll talk about in just a minute, the purpose, structure, argument, and attitude of the speaker. The long comparative passages are the ones that tend to give people fits. They are lengthy, and again, they're going to ask you very difficult questions about the author's attitude in passage 1 and the author's attitude in passage 2, and how they compare or contrast or how they reinforce each other. The last type of critical reading passage that you'll get is the prose passage, and most people do better on the prose passages or the short passages. Prose passages are asking you to take a piece from like a short story or a novel and analyze that prose piece. And again, you've been doing this in your English class for a long time, where they ask you things about characterization, they ask you things about plot, they'll ask you things about why authors employ certain diction. So prose passages are a good place to get some points on the board for the critical reading section. So those are the different passages that you're going to encounter. One of the biggest questions that I always get is, will I have enough time? Yes. Because the vocabulary section is relatively short, it's less than a minute per question, you do have time to read these passages and practice the PSAT method, where you're thinking about the purpose, the structure, the argument, and the attitude as you go through. In fact, you'll have more time if you read it carefully the first, and then you don't have to go back and reread and reread and reread again. So those are the different types of critical reading passages that you're going to see. Okay, so now for Captain of the Obvious moment. Make sure that you read the passages. Don't skim them. You need to stop periodically, pause, and read slowly. I promise you will have time to finish, but you'll do better if you read the passage fully and actually take the time to stop and comprehend it. You all know that there's a difference between reading and reading. Reading where you skim it, and reading where you actually read to understand. Don't just skim, okay? So the acronym to remember is PSAA, right? What is the purpose of this? Is it to argue something? Is it to inform? Is it to persuade? So what's the purpose of the passage? Right? Second thing to consider, what's the structure? So do they have a thesis and then an example and then another example? What kind of structure does this piece have? How do they support their argument, right? Third, what is the argument? If you had to come up with a thesis for this particular passage, what would you say that the author's purpose or message is, right? And then the final piece is, what is the attitude of the speaker? That, of course, is the tone. Are they angry? Are they upset? Are they joyful? Or is this simply just an informative passage where the tone is completely neutral? You should be able to answer, when you're finished with the passage, all of those PSAA pieces. You also need to make sure you pause periodically and summarize the material to yourself as you go. It's essential that you do this. Okay, so another section that you are going to have are the long comparative passages. Long comparative passages are going to ask you to compare, contrast, talk about what the author of passage 1 would say about passage 2, and here's where you're usually going to find the harder of the questions. The last type of passage that you're going to see on the SAA and PSAT are the prose passages, where they give you a piece from like a short story and they ask you to make some analytical sense of the piece. So those are ones that most people are a little bit more familiar with, and those are the passages that people tend to get higher scores on simply because you're used to analyzing a short story and looking at character development, looking at tone, looking at theme. But again, you're doing that same kind of critical reading on each of the sections. So your critical reading section score can be bolstered if you read the passages, obviously. There's a difference again between reading and really reading a passage. This one is going to ask you to really read a passage. It's also going to ask you specific questions about what is there in the passage. So you really do have to read carefully, because they're not asking you to extrapolate. And sometimes in English class, if they're asking you about a symbol, there's room for interpretations. In the critical reading section, they're going to ask you particular pointed questions about what does the passage say. So make sure you read. Pause every few lines and constantly ask yourself the following questions, which I've referred to as the PSAA method. What is the purpose of the passage? Is it to inform? Is it to explain? Is it arguing a particular point? What is the purpose, right? If it's fiction, obviously maybe it's meant to entertain. So what's the purpose? What is the structure of the passage? Again, we're used to having the thesis at the very end of the intro paragraph. That is not always the case with these critical reading passages. So what do? Do they present the thesis and then give 2 examples of that? Do they present the thesis, give an example, and then offer a counterclaim? What is the structure? How do they build that argument? What is the argument? If you had to give a thesis of this particular piece, what is the thesis that you would come up with? So what is the author's argument in the piece? Again, if it's just explaining something, the argument is whatever their general subject or purpose is. And then the last piece is the attitude of the speaker, the attitude of the writer. Are they being harsh and critical? What are they advocating? Are they advocating it with any kinds of maybe short little pieces where they're suggesting that there might be an alternative, so they're a little more guarded in what they're suggesting? Or are they forcibly arguing this particular piece? Are they critical, condemnatory? What is the attitude of that speaker? You're going to notice that when you start looking at the passages ask you things like, what is the primary purpose the passage focuses on? And all of those are questions that if you have stopped and practiced the PSAA method, you're going to be able to answer those questions quickly and without having to go back to refer to the passage. Which describes the relationship between the passage, right? How would passage 1 respond to passage 2? What is the primary concern of passage 2? Those are all examples of questions that you can answer if you stop and practice the PSAA method. And I promise you will have time to read the passages. You'll actually have more time than if you just simply skim the passages and then try to answer the questions. This is going to sound dumb, but make sure you're actually reading the piece. Stop every sentence or so and really make sure that you can paraphrase what the argument is. They're going to use words that you might not be familiar with, and that's all right. Make sure you use context clues. The passages are generally from the 2 subjects that people don't like the most. One is going to be history, and the other one is science. Those are 2 subjects that people generally struggle with. So because they know that people don't like these subjects, they bank on the fact that people are going to skim, they're not going to read, they'll get bored, they'll read only the questions and not read the actual passages. In order to answer these questions, you do have to read, right? Don't get deterred by the subject matter. Don't think you won't finish. You will. You'll finish much more quickly if you actually stop and read the passages as opposed to reading the questions, realizing you didn't realize what you were reading at the time, and having to go back and start all over again. So again, do the PSAA method. All right, so I'm going to run you through the general rules that I follow when I'm trying to score well on the SAT or PSAT. So I'm looking in the section of the first critical reading section where it's questions 9 through 10 based on the following passage. This is in your text on page 6. All right, so this is how I would go about doing it. I came back from Africa with ideas for a new piece of art, more primitive than I had ever done before. So again, I'd pause and stop. This is about where the artist gets inspiration. He uses the term primitive, and most of the time primitive means something that's rudimentary. But here he goes on to explain what primitive means to him. Primitive is a word I like to use in a positive way to explain the completeness of a concept in art. So again, it's not being used negatively here. For him, primitive means a complete piece. So what makes a complete piece? I like to layer and pattern and embellish my art in the manner of tribal art. And then again, like a blues singer, I like to repeat and repeat again. So again, this particular artist likes patterns, layers, and embellishment. So again, little stuff is not enough. You have to do it again and again. So again, think a very busy piece of art. Also uses a simile like a blues singer. If you listen to blues riffs, they tend to repeat over and over again, like a chorus, if you will. And that's what art means to this particular writer. Fragmented, understated, or minimalist art forms frustrate me. So again, not a minimalist. I want to finish them. In the 1960s, there was a minimalist aesthetic advocating less is more. So again, aesthetic means the appreciation of beauty. So in the 1960s, there was this idea that less is more. So again, you could have a minimalist piece of art, right? This particular writer or author wants to see more embellishment in art. To me, less is even less, and more is still not quite enough. So if I did the PSAT method, the purpose, of course, is to explain where he gets the inspiration and what kind of art he appreciates. In terms of the attitude of the speaker, supporting art that is embellished, art that is not minimalist. In terms of the argument, less is more is not correct. Art should be embellished. And as the attitude of the speaker is just sort of matter of fact supporting this idea that art should not be minimalist. So if you look at number 9, the primary purpose of the passage is to describe a creative philosophy, explain the origins of a concept, spark an artistic impulse, provide a historical overview, or offer a technical lesson. The answer to this one is obviously A. The artist is explaining the creative philosophy, this primitive art, and what it means to him or her. Right? Number 10, the mention of the blues singer in line 6 primarily serves to suggest a possible audience for a type of artwork? No. Indicate the widespread popularity of a vocalist? No. Identify a possible artistic collaboration? No. Draw a parallel between a style of art and a style of music? Express admiration for a musical form? No. The answer to that one is D. Just like blues riffs repeat, so too should art. So if you do the PSAT method, like I said, you stop periodically and explain what's going on, you'll be able to predict the questions that they ask you. The long passages are those that generally flummox people. So here's some advice. Again, practice that SPAA method. Stop periodically and make sure that you can articulate why the passages are saying what they're saying. Don't just kind of gloss over it. Constantly stop and think about what you're reading and what the purpose, what the structure, what the argument, and what the attitude of those speakers happen to be. As you're doing that, make sure that you're breaking it down in little small chunks. Don't get too distracted by some of the words that they're going to use. Again, they tend to use larger vocabulary in there because it's going to deter people. Make sure you try to use context clues to the best of your ability. So again, if you take a look at passage number, the first passage, questions 13 through 24 on page 7 of the SAT or PSAT practice piece, it starts with passage 1 saying this: 4 decades ago, the United States faced a creeping menace to national security. The Soviet Union had lobbed the first satellite into space in 1957. So again, we're talking about the space race. We're talking about the contradictory attitudes of the United States and the Soviet Union and the competition that ensued. Then, on April 12, 1961, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin blasted off in Vostok 1 and became the first human in orbit. President Kennedy understood that dominating space could mean the difference between a country able to defend itself and one at the mercy of its rivals. So again, here they get to the kind of point that the space race was about establishing dominance. In a May 1961 address to Congress, President Kennedy unveiled Apollo, a 10-year program of federal subsidies aimed at landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. So again, as part of that program of dominance, they instituted Apollo, and Apollo's job was to show the United States dominance of the space race. Congress appropriated the funds, scientists and engineers put their noses to the launch pad, and Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon 8 years later. So again, cause and effect, it was important, Congress did this, President approved, ta-da, we have man on the moon. But this whole passage is not about that. When we take the second piece, it says the country now faces a similar situation. So we're making an analogy, a logical leap between one thing and the other. Reliance on foreign oil. Just as we responded to the Soviet space superiority with a bold commitment, so now the United States must respond to the clout of foreign oil by making energy independence a national priority. So again, making an analogy, a comparison here. You can call it a simile, if you will, or a metaphor. Again, trying to compare one space race to a new kind of race for independence. All right, when you read these passages, one of the tricks that I would suggest is that when you're finished and you do the PSAT method, try to give passage 1 and passage 2 a short little nickname based on their positions. So passage 1 guy, you might refer to him as independence and energy man, or something like that, because they're going to ask you questions to compare the author of passage 1 and 2, and sometimes it can get really convoluted or confusing as to which passage they're talking about. So if you look at question 16, for example, it says lines 16 through 32 suggests that the author of passage 1 would most likely respond to the assessment in lines 92 through 95, passage 2, by pointing out that it's much easier if you can articulate that pro-independence from foreign energy would most likely respond to the cautionary passage 2 by saying this. That sometimes helps me with those questions that are a little bit confusing in their syntax. All right, the grammar and the writing section. This is the section that it's easiest to improve your score on because you can study. There are certain patterns that they're going to employ, and once you start learning those patterns to the questions and how regular those questions occur, you can begin to predict and to look for those particular errors. So I'm going to run through quickly some of those patterns to look for. And again, I would suggest that you make yourself a little index card with those on them, and then as you go through the PSAT practice, you not only label what the answer to the question is, but also what kind of question it is. All right, so here are the most common ones. Subject-verb agreement. We would recognize that "we is going to the store" is not correct. But sometimes when you're in a hurry or when they're carefully camouflaged, you can miss subject-verb agreement. So always find the subject of the sentence and check it against the verb to make sure that it agrees in the case and the number. The second thing is pronoun agreement. We have to make sure that the pronouns that we're using agree again in case and number. So while we say in conversation that someone left their book, someone is singular, which means someone left his or her book. Parallelism is another piece that they ask lots of questions about. Not only parallelism of verbs, meaning they have to be the same, so you could not say something like, I like to swim to run and eating Twinkies. It has to be to swim, to run, and to eat Twinkies. So there has to be that parallelism. There also has to be parallelism of sentence parts. So for example, if the sentence says that John grew more vegetables, or John's garden grew more vegetables than his neighbors, you're comparing vegetables to neighbors. So that doesn't work. It would have to be that John's garden grew more vegetables than his neighbor's garden. And again, that kind of parallelism can be tricky when you're reading sentences. Sentence reduction. It used to be true, especially like in 8th grade, that the longest answer was always the correct one. And on the SAT and PSAT, that is not the case. They like to get you to reduce sentences, get rid of redundancies, and get rid of syntax that is garbled or hard to understand. So don't be afraid to shorten sentences. Comma splices are commas that are hanging out in the wrong place. They're commas that are where they're not supposed to go, such as in between two complete sentences. So you'll have to fix a comma splice, and oftentimes only one answer will correct that comma splice. Wrong prepositions. One of the things that the PSAT looks at is how fluent you are in the English language. So this is one for people who are English as a second language learners. Certain verbs can only take certain prepositions. And again, it's one of those things that you either know or you don't. And so again, to see whether people are completely fluent and know some of these subtle nuances, they'll ask the wrong prepositions or put the wrong prepositions in sentences. Incorrect connections or logic, that's where you have the wrong connector word between sentences. So if I said something like, Susie has hives and is allergic to something, because she has the hives, obviously it's because she's allergic to something. And so to say that she has hives and she's allergic to something is the wrong connection to make there. So the logic is off. And then clauses that are improperly placed. The clause that modifies the noun needs to come close to that. And so oftentimes they'll make a sentence convoluted so that the clause is improperly placed and it's not modifying the right word. So these are just a few of them, and there are a couple of extra random ones that they'll throw in there. But if you can train yourself to look for these few pieces of incorrect sentences, then you'll be able to do much better on the grammar and writing section. So the grammar section has two different pieces to it. There's one where there'll be sentences that you have to fix the underlined portion, and then the second section where you just have to identify the error. So looking at section 5 of the PSAT practice test, question number 21 says, all along the highway was vacant new office buildings, evidence that the economic boom the area had experienced was proving to be short-lived. This is a good example of subject-verb agreement. All along the highway were vacant new office buildings. Office buildings is your noun, so office buildings were vacant all along the highway. And again, that's an example of subject-verb agreement. They oftentimes do that on one of the other PSAT practices. They gave this sentence: niacin, which is a commonly overlooked vitamin, along with many others, are important in cellular functioning. The subject of your sentence is niacin, so niacin is important in cellular functioning. So again, oftentimes when you look at sentences, what we need, right? What we need is your subject. What we need is more pots and pans. Either is also singular, so either one of the boys is welcome to come to dinner. And again, those can be very tricky when you're going through quickly. So always find the subject of the sentence and check it against the verb to make sure that it is correct. Pronoun agreement is one of the really common errors that they will ask you to correct. The pronoun has got to match the antecedent, what comes before it. So they'll ask this in a variety of different kinds of ways, but always check, again, the nouns that you have and then the pronoun that follows. So again, the professor told his students to follow your dreams. The professors told his students, and your doesn't match, told his students to follow their dreams. They ask a variation of that in the practice test, question 1. The graduation speaker advised the students to devote yourself to a few passions and to seek excellence in those specific areas. So again, the answer to that one would be B, to devote themselves. Here's another example. The history of rhetoric has more than their share of critics. The history of rhetoric is, again, a singular thing, so the history has more than its share of critics would be correct. So again, oftentimes they'll ask pronoun agreement. Question number 16 in the practice test, for example, is a pronoun agreement piece. So always check those sentence parts and pieces for pronoun agreement. So with sentence reduction, they're oftentimes going to ask you to take out the extra or superfluous words in a sentence. So one of the more ridiculous questions that they've ever had on the SAT was one that read like this: I'm going to the store to buy a food item, which is bread. Again, nobody says that, and again, it's redundant. So sometimes you have to get rid of that redundancy in the sentence. So an example of some of that sentence reduction and clarity is question number 19 in section 5 on the practice test. In section 5, it says exhibitions of some works by modern artists have spurred political controversy over should they continue federal support of art. So again, we in this sentence need an object of the preposition over. It has to be a thing. That should they continue federal support of art is a little bulky as a thing. We simply need a noun here. So C, continued federal support of art, again, is much easier in terms of understanding that sentence. And so C is the correct answer for question number 19. In short, don't be afraid to reduce sentences. Even though one might sound more complex, it's not necessarily. The other thing to recall here is that in English, the grammatical construction being that does not exist. I'm not sure where it's come from in English, but being that is not a syntactical phrase that we can use in English. Like being that I am an English teacher, we use since. So if you ever see a being that in a sentence, you know that it's wrong and it's something that needs to be fixed immediately. So a comma splice is a comma someplace that it's not allowed to go, like for example between two complete sentences. When you have two complete sentences or two independent clauses, you can join those with a semicolon. You cannot use a comma. So in section 5, question number 17, they give you an example of a comma splice. In addition to racing rocket-powered vehicles, Kitty O'Neill worked as a stunt woman, comma. She performed physical feats called for in shows such as The Bionic Woman. In this particular piece, you cannot leave the sentence as it is because of that comma splice. It invalidates the sentence. So in order to make it work, you'd have to find a way to take out that comma and make that last little piece a dependent clause. So again, the answer to that one would end up being D, a stunt woman performing the physical feats called for. So you have to do something to get rid of comma splices. So again, pay attention to the punctuation. If you have a comma splice, it has to be fixed. And many of them will not fix the comma splice, and so you can immediately rule those out as answers. So parallelism can be of a number of different things. You can have parallelism of verb tenses. So again, all the verbs have to be the same. You could have parallelism of noun or parallelism of sentence parts. So here is an example of the parallelism of the pieces. I enjoy a variety of activities including watching movies, the ing, being with people, and discussing philosophy, and going to the gym. Right? The second one, John's garden grew more vegetables than his neighbor. Again, we're implying that it's his neighbor's garden, but it's not directly stated. What you're saying here in this sentence is that his neighbor grew vegetables. And again, the neighbor is not physically capable of growing vegetables. So it's John's garden grew more vegetables than his neighbor's garden. That's parallelism of sentence parts. So let me give you an example of a relatively easy one on the PSAT practice. For question number 23, it says farmers who face droughts, tornadoes, and have falling prices for their crops must often work long hours 7 days a week. So farmers face droughts, tornadoes, and falling prices. You can't have falling prices there at the end because it creates sentence parts that are not parallel. So, certain verbs in English take certain prepositions. There really is no way to predict or to explain all of them. And what this question is looking for is, are you a native speaker? We'll automatically recognize that they're wrong, but people, again, whose English is not their native language might have a little difficulty with this one. So here's an example of the wrong preposition. I am envious at so many celebrities who can spend money on lavish items. The word envious takes the preposition of. I am envious of so many celebrities. So that would be incorrect. The lady was shocked of her husband's infidelity. She was shocked at her husband's infidelity. Again, there's certain verbs that can only take certain prepositions. You can be inspired by something, or you can take inspiration from something. But again, those prepositions are very specific to the verbs. So again, oftentimes they'll ask you whether or not a prepositional phrase that goes with a verb is correct. So incorrect connections are asking you to look at some of those fanboys, for, and, nor, but, and, or, yet, and so. And what they're asking you to do is to see where those sentence connectors make incorrect logic. So again, in section 5, number 7 says primatologist Janice Carter arrived in West Africa in 1977 for what she expected to be a stay of only 3 days. So she remained there to this day. Okay, so another big problem are clauses that are improperly placed. So, for example, if you take a look at this example sentence, working in the 19th century, the subject is the writings. This sentence says the writings were working in the 19th century. The writings weren't working in the 19th century. Charles Dickens was working in the 19th century. So again, this is something that's improperly placed. And you'll see this a lot on the PSAT. So always make sure you find that subject and make sure that that clause properly modifies it. Here's an example. On section 5, number 14, long thought to be a fruit unfit for eating, they. So in this sentence, they are a fruit unfit for eating. Again, obviously that's incorrect. Another example of that you can see is question 11 on the practice test. It says, after serving 10 years as foreign minister, they elected Golda Meir Prime Minister of Israel in 1969. So after serving 10 years as foreign minister, they. So again, they are the ones who served for 10 years as foreign minister. Well, that's obviously incorrect. Golda Meir is the one who served as prime minister. So be careful and take a look at those sentences. When you're going really fast, it can be tricky. When they're pointed out to you, you see them. But again, as quickly as you're going with these sections, just keep in mind that that's one of the things that you should be looking for. So as we're looking at the sections, there's always going to be problems with sentence fragments. Little sentences that are missing something like a verb or a subject that's going to make it a complete sentence. So anytime you see those fragments, you're going to have to make some changes in order to make them real complete sentences. So if you take a look at section 5, question 18, it says the success of Dracula, Bram Stoker's novel about a Transylvanian vampire, far surpassing any of his other novels dealing with supernatural themes. If you look at this, it doesn't have a verb. His novel surpassed other novels. So again, when we look at this, we're going to have to fix it so that we have a real sentence here. So as you're going through, just keep in mind that they tend to repeat some of the same kinds of pattern questions over and over again. That same thing that you just see in that question about Bram Stoker is the same problem that you see in question number 5 in practice section 5. So these problems repeat over and over again. So a good way to practice for the SAT or PSAT and up your score is not only to identify the correct answer, but also to figure out what kind of sentence problem it is. Because again, when you get to the last section of the practice test, the one with the sentences, there's always that pesky E, no error. And again, there are very few E, no errors in a section, usually 2, maybe 3 at the max. You rarely see E's, no errors. So again, there are a few, but as you're going through, make sure you've ruled out all of the other issues before you choose E, no error. So the last section in the grammar part is the grammar passage. This is different than the critical reading. What they're asking you to do is to read it, but also to revise certain sections grammatically. Some people try to do this without reading the passage, and I do not advise that you do that. Some of the revisions will change the meaning of the sentence and change the meaning of the piece if you revise them in a particular way. So it is essential that you read the passage. Again, read it carefully, do the PSAT method where you look at the purpose, the structure, the attitude, and the argument, and then they're going to ask you questions about the grammar of that. How would you revise things? Where would you insert sentences? How could you perhaps make this particular sentence better by combining it? So when you look at this particular piece, just be careful because some of the sentence revisions will change the entire meaning of the article. So make sure you know the point of the passage and the argument that is being made. So when you look at that last section, again, you don't have to be quite as careful in your reading, but do make sure that you are reading it so that when you're looking at the passages to fix it, you make the correct revisions to the passage. So again, they're going to ask you to do things like sentence combining. They're going to ask you to do things such as adding a preliminary trailer to something. They're going to ask you to make some connections, and all of those you have to read the passage in order to do it. So make sure you read the passage carefully. So if you're taking the actual SAT as opposed to the PSAT, the writing section comes first. Now with the writing section, they are going to give you a prompt, and it's always a prompt that can be answered as a this or a this. So again, I often think of that commercial with the hamsters with the you can get with this or you can get with that. It doesn't matter which way you answer. The best strategy is to come up with a two-part thesis, right? To give a complex but yet bi-part type thesis where you have two paragraphs arguing different points of that particular piece. In each paragraph, you should try to give two solid, concrete answers. Now, be careful. They tell you that you can use personal examples. You may use personal examples, but please make sure that they are insightful and not simply things like, I've seen bullying in my school. It can be bad. They really want some kind of example of something particular that you've seen or done that's really exciting and that will differentiate yourself from your peers. Otherwise, stay away from personal examples. Use example from history. Use example from literature. Remember, this is a test that's showing how much smarter you are than your peers. So make sure the examples do you justice and actually do show your erudition. So in each paragraph, you should have two examples. And then in the conclusion paragraph, I know you'll be rushing, but in the conclusion, try to address some of the counter arguments. Finally, in the conclusion, think about some of the bigger picture questions. What is this question really asking you to think about? So for example, one question that they love to ask was, do natural disasters unite or divide people? And again, they're asking about natural disasters, but really what they're asking you to do is to do some theoretical inquiry into the nature of people. What are people like? And again, in moments of natural disasters, do we revert to our usual kind of cynicism and selfishness? What do we do and how do we behave? So there's usually a greater implication to the question. And in the conclusion, if you can address that greater implication, you'll get a better score. Obviously, be careful with your grammar and your syntax and your diction. Make sure that when you begin your introduction with your hook, that you don't restate if they give you a quotation. Don't use that quotation. Again, they've seen it 1,000 times before. So same kind of structure that you've used in your paragraphs before. You have your hook, your explanation, grounds the question, make sure you explain the sides, and then you have your complex thesis in two parts. Strong topic sentences related to the thesis piece. Make sure you have 2 examples in each body paragraph that are strong. And then in your conclusion, you're going to address the counter arguments and address the bigger picture of the question itself. So hopefully this gave you some insight into the kind of things that you can do to prepare for the SAT and PSAT tests. Sometimes they'll tell you things like you can't study, it's an aptitude test, and that's not entirely true. You can prepare yourself for the type of questions that you're going to be asked. You can prepare yourself by seeing what kinds of things work best for you, and you can prepare yourself by looking through this particular PowerPoint and kind of familiarizing yourself with the kinds of questions they ask, because they ask them over and over again. So some final little pieces of information or words of wisdom from Dr. Miller. Make sure you eat breakfast in the morning. This test is long. You do not want to be distracted by thoughts of food or the fact that you are really hungry while you're taking the test. Make sure before you go into the test that your calculator works and that your pencil works and has enough lead if you're using a mechanical one, or that it's well sharpened if you're using just a traditional pencil. Breathe, relax, and know that you are going to do well. The test is not the end-all, be-all of existence. It is not going to determine necessarily whether you get into that university or not. But again, by practicing these various kinds of tips, you can increase your chances. So again, when you take the test, relax, focus, and realize that you are going to do well. So a couple of people have asked questions about how to read your PSAT scores, how to use them as predictors. And they'll tell you a couple of things if you go to the actual College Board site. I'm going to give you a slightly different way to read your PSAT scores, one that I think is a little bit more helpful for you. So the old SAT, before they added the writing section, was out of 1,600. That was a perfect score. So if you take a look at your verbal score, which is the English portion, and the math score, on the PSAT, the top score that you can get in each section is an 80. So an 80 is the perfect score. And that correlates to an 800 on the old SAT. So let's say you took the PSAT and you score a 62 in the verbal section. That's going to correlate to a 620 verbal. Likewise, if you get a math score of a 52, that's going to correlate to a 520 on the math SAT. When you add your scores together, you're going to ignore the writing section. With the PSAT, without that essay, it's very hard to kind of even get a ballpark figure of how you're going to fare on that section. But just to give yourself an idea of where you fall vis-a-vis your peers, a 1200 was the kind of basic cutoff score for schools like UVA, William & Mary, James Madison, and Virginia Tech before they changed the SAT. So if you get a 600 or a 60 on the verbal section and a 60 or a 600 in the math section, you can be pretty sure that when you take your SATs, you're going to get the kind of scores that you need to be accepted into that school. So I think that that's kind of a helpful way to look at your PSAT scores. You can also, of course, look at how well you scored and how what percentile you were in, but I think that it's much easier if you just add a 0 to the verbal and you add a 0 to the math, and that gives you an idea of where you fall. The other thing to keep in mind that the PSAT, because it's the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test, tends to be a little bit harder than the SAT itself. So sometimes if you don't score as high on the PSAT as you'd like, it might be because you haven't finished or completed a geometry or math class. Obviously each year in English, your English skills are going to get a little bit stronger, so that's going to be one of the reasons that it goes up, but also because of the difficulty level of the test. Sometimes you'll notice that your PSAT and SAT scores are very different. For me, I went up several hundred points just from one year to the next, and that's not unusual or abnormal. So again, just in terms of reading your scores, one of the best ways to look at it is, again, to look at it as a gauge or an index of your verbal and your math scores. And so again, to look at your math score, take whatever it is, add a 0, take your verbal score, whatever it is on the PSAT, and add a 0. And again, when you look at your combined score, a 1600 was perfect. If you're aiming for someplace like MIT, you absolutely want it someplace near perfect. But again, if you're looking for schools like UVA or Madison, the 1200 is a good score for you for the moment.